Thank you, everyone, for staying through the credits. As a filmmaker myself, I think it's important sometimes just to see what a village it takes to make a film like this happen. My name is Pearl Gluck. I am an assistant professor. Where are you, Cecilio? Come sit. A film here at Penn State. But I'm also another person you can add to the list of filmmakers and activists that Judith has inspired, literally by throwing a napkin in my face and telling me to make my own movie 2 decades ago, and I did. And now here I am at Penn State, moderating a conversation between 3 truly incredible people with regard to this new film, Cooked. We're honored to have Judith here. She would like to immediately open it up for what she calls a popcorn feedback, which we will do. But just briefly, I also want to say we have Isaac Vergun here, who's going to talk about his own activism and youth activism. We have Dr. Cecilio Ortiz Garcia. I think that your mother's name is Ortiz, right? Yes. And Dad's Garcia. I just learned something backstage. From Puerto Rico, who is here teaching as well, and he himself is also a filmmaker. Go for it, Judith.
Oh, so can we bring the lights up so we could see everyone's face? Is that possible?
Well, we know Judith gets what she wants, so it's possible.
Right. Good. Okay. So what I often like to do, especially when we have a panel, and you've just watched this, is before everyone else talks that we get to hear from you. So just first thoughts, not really big long sentences, but a word or two, a sentence, and your zip code.
And there are mics on the 2 sides.
Yes, the top of the heart. Off your
popcorn. What do we got?
First of all, thank you a lot. The zip code here is 16803. The zip code in Chicago is 60615. Okay, and I'm wondering, you spent a lot of time in Inglewood, and I'm wondering that you didn't go east, and I'm wondering if that had anything to do with the influence of the University of Chicago.
I wasn't going to answer. I was just going to gather. But I'm gonna. Okay, and I might come back to you and ask you what you really mean, because I might not know. Being a New Yorker, I might not totally get what you mean. Okay, so. Okay, but I'll answer after. I promise. Okay, more thoughts. Top of the heart. Oh, come on. Okay, back there.
Made her want to scream 16801.
I'm also 16803. It reminded me of the importance of exactly what you say, building infrastructure and economic development in advance, because the best way we're going to deal with things like the coronavirus and the flu is to ensure that people have access to public health, to health care, and that we have a strong, robust public health infrastructure that helps people daily, not just in disasters.
Thank you.
If you want.
You can scream it out.
Yeah.
16801, invest in happiness.
Amen.
Systemic racism since the 50s, even before that, way before that, in Chicago particularly, and 16827.
I would say adaptation, and my zip code is 16801.
Thank you.
Nostalgic, 19013.
Nostalgic. Okay, one more.
Relearning, 07032.
We have one more up front, and then.
I think that it enforced and reminded me of how broken our systems are, and how not only that they're broken, but that they're intentionally broken. And 16801.
Thank you. I'm going to start by introducing Isaac at the end there and ask him to talk a teeny bit about how this affected him, because we've brought you a couple of really impactful activists who will interact with Judith, and of course she'll take your questions after. We want to spend about 15 minutes having a conversation up here and then open it up to you if that's okay with you. And if not, just raise your hand and we'll come right over and get your question. Forgive me, but I would really like to read to you what it says here on this paper, just to get their bios right, so that you can be here with me to understand where some of these voices are coming from. So Isaac Vergun is 17 years old. He's a sprinter, he's a cross-country runner, a climate activist, and was a federal plaintiff in the case Juliana et al. Versus United States, in which 21 students sued the federal government over climate inaction and its threat to their constitutional rights. Well, based on that reaction, I'll read you the sentence. I was like, we'll move to the next one. It's so important. What do I do? Do I leave it in? I'm leaving it in. At 11 years old, Isaac got the attention of Bill McKibben by stepping onto stage to ask about starting a divestment campaign for his hometown of Beaverton, Oregon. He has since co-founded Youth Acting for Our Earth, yay? Did I say yay correctly? Okay, good. And is its lead youth climate leader, bringing the program to 4 states and counting to train other students to be climate ambassadors. He's also a team board member of the Oregon Jewish Community Youth Foundation. Welcome, Isaac, to Penn State. We're so happy to have you here at the State Theater. Personally, as you can imagine, since I just shared with you what Judith did in my life, I'm also very excited for you to meet Judith. So give us some of your thoughts about this film and how it connects to what you've been committing so much of your life to.
Well, I'm gonna start with a little personal connection to Chicago. So I was adopted from Chicago when I was 2 days old. I haven't really gone back since, but the deep-rooted racism and systemic racism throughout the whole entire system in Chicago is an example of not just Chicago, but also New York City, and I say also Portland, which is where I'm from. And it really rung home, especially the fact that, number one, the system is broken, but also number two, that it's catering to the wrong audience. Like, we see these first responders preparing for all these disasters, like extreme national disasters, like hurricanes, tornadoes, and all that, but to the wrong communities, and they're preparing for massive things that could happen potentially, but they're completely blind to the things that are happening right now, the things that are affecting people in the communities literally right next door, as you've exampled through the whole entire movie, which I find is really important, because a lot of the times people don't understand that things happen because we don't see it happen, and that bringing it into the front and making a documentary about it, speaking about it to other universities and other places is very important, and that's how we're gonna make change in the end. And also, one scene in particular that I found was really interesting was when you visited the military base and training base in Kentucky, and that they weren't even thinking, or they're not even necessarily willing to budge about fixing their methodology of preparedness and disaster readiness and trying to apply it to what's happening now. Because we think of the military as, or the Coast Guard as, it's a national disaster, we gotta send the military in to save everybody. But those resources that we spend millions and billions of tax dollars on, we could be spending on right now in our own cities, in Chicago, in New York, in Portland, and really fix the things that we literally see every day that aren't necessarily on the national attention or on the national scheme, but really affect our communities.
Amen to that. And Isaac, why are you here? Why did you come to State College? Tell us. We saw your picture up there, but now we have you right in front of us, and he's not just saying it, he's also doing it. Tell us what you're doing this weekend here.
Well, this weekend I'm going to be holding Youth Acting for Our Earth training this Saturday at 8:45 a.m. It's open to everyone to come and register. We kind of do it from K through 12 graders, and it's a one-day training where we do a workshop about climate change. So we talk about climate justice, what we can do about it, what has been done about it, and what we're willing to do for it. And I've been doing this for a long time, and I am pleased to bring it out here to Penn State and to the East Coast.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Isaac, for being here. I'm also going to introduce you to Cecilio Ortiz Garcia. Dr. Garcia is a senior fellow at the National Council for Science and the Environment and co-chair of RISE, Resilience in Sustainable Reconstruction. It is developed in the wake of Hurricane Maria, one of the worst disasters in Puerto Rico's history, resulting in nearly 3,000 deaths and over 90 billion of economic loss. RISE seeks to develop new strategies and approaches for universities and colleges acting in pre- and post-natural disaster environments to address ethical and logistical concerns about their efforts. Dr. Garcia is currently a visiting scholar here at Penn State. Can you also answer that same question? How did watching the film make instant connections for you, which I think are rather obvious to us on some levels, but maybe just begin to share. And I should also add, I know this, I don't know if it's not on here for a particular reason or maybe, but you've done a documentary as well about some of these issues.
I haven't done them, but I certainly have collaborated with filmmakers and advised them in their production. It's funny, and first of all, thank you for this invitation. Thanks for your art and your passion, and thanks for your courage. When you know that structural conditions are against you, getting up every day is an event of courage. I thought that watching this movie, and as we watch documentaries and movies about events associated with climate change and extreme operating environments, which is a really bad euphemism too, would get better after we lived through Maria, and I'm afraid it's not that way. What happened tonight is that as scientists, we are trained, we were talking about this, we are trained to look for patterns, tendencies, and make sense of reality, utilizing the methodologies we master. And when we face art, it makes us humble as scientists. And it makes us understand that sometimes we can throw as much science as we want at these wicked type of problems, but what admiring art, reflecting on it does is actually it makes you humble. It humbles you in a way that it doesn't stop you from doing, but it's like an action humility. It humbles you in a way that you start questioning, why shouldn't I do this? Or why shouldn't I cross my discipline? Why shouldn't I concentrate on an issue rather than on my tenure? Why? These are big questions in academia, and that's, I think, RISE is less of an acronym and more of a state of mind, more of a way of thinking as an academic, as an academic institution. What role are you really here to play in your neighborhood, in 16801? Oh, by the way, mine is 00680, Mayaguez, Puerto Rico. And we have the University of Puerto Rico in Mayaguez. It's in my hometown. So that's the neighborhood I live in, and the university, like at State College, is at the center of it. And at the time of need, my university wasn't there. And I have to live through other universities coming to Puerto Rico, and I am used to be the observer. As a scientist, I became the observed. And that experience totally changed me. Totally changed me. I don't want to take more time.
No, actually, that's actually really powerful. Thank you so much for sharing that, and it's a powerful transition to talking about Judith, in fact, the observer and the observed, and also the humility that we feel when we face art, especially when it's also this incredibly humble call to action. So I'm going to say a couple things about Judith, if you don't mind. I mean, we've been singing her praises as people who have learned from her, but she's begging me not to give this to you, which means I'm only going to give you the entire thing. So Judith is a New York-based director, best known for her ability, I don't need to say this, but I'll say it, her quirky sense of humor, her irony, her personal storytelling chops, and the power of transparency to tackle some of the most pressing issues of our time. I insist on reading this because, in fact, not all of her films are about the same subjects. Her films are about toxic chemical exposure, are about climate change, about the politics of disaster. Her films have premiered at Sundance, have been nationally broadcast on PBS, HBO, and the Sundance Channel. Blue Vinyl received the Sundance Excellence Awards in Cinematography and 2 Emmy nominations, and its prequel, which is How I Met Judith, a healthy baby girl about the DES, the crisis that was caused with DES, won a Peabody Award. Helfand is a field builder, this is important, Judith, who co-founded 2 critical organizations, both of which have affected hundreds of filmmakers, Working Films and Chicken and Egg Pictures. These are both organizations that don't always necessarily make films, but they enable them to happen, and then they teach this exact way that Judith makes her films, which is movement around the film. You know, it's easy to just change a channel or turn a page. Her films within themselves, as you can see, are a call to action within the film. In 2007, Helfand received a United States Artist Fellowship. In 2016, she was invited to join the Academy of Motion Picture Arts and Sciences, member of the Oscars. Right? That's where you vote on documentaries. She's in post-production on her new feature, Love and Stuff, an intergenerational love story about mourning her mother and becoming a quote-unquote new old mom at the same time. And if this is of interest to you, the short version of it is on the New York Times Shorts. They've started this new program, which is wonderful short documentaries made by artists such as Judith. So you can see little bits and pieces of what they're working on in their longer features. So with that said, forgive me, Judith, I just really wanted to bring the audience in so that we're all on the same page. I want to ask you to talk a little bit about the insistence on keeping your voice in a film. You know, as you know, my first film was also autobiographical, and frankly, it was you who made sure it remained so. And I think exactly what you were just saying about making sure that one can be affected by your work, you actually show that you yourself are. But at the same time, I can imagine that you were probably asked to try and remove yourself from this. I've seen a number of cuts of this, and so I want to ask you about that. Why do you continue to put yourself into your own stories, and how did it happen with this one?
Well, in this case, I actually did not intend to be in this movie at all. In fact, I made a promise to someone, like, this time I'm not going to be in the movie. And it was only going to be about Chicago, and it was going to be kind of like this, it was going to be like a whodunit. Like, how did all these people get murdered like this? And I thought that was where it was going to end. And if Katrina had not happened 6 weeks to the day that I started doing like very intense interviewing, and the day we finished the fundraising trailer, and I really did think that this was an extraordinary event, and it was kind of a one-off. I'd never heard of extreme weather revealing extreme disparity. I'd never heard of a social autopsy before. I was really gonna follow Eric's book and do that social autopsy. And then Katrina happened, and I just felt like I can't quite do that anymore. I can't quite make that movie. And so when I went back to Chicago next, I bypassed the heat wave, and I asked actually Greg Mittman at UMadison, I said, who do you know that is actually working on, I guess what you could call urban solutions to climate change, and sort of have a climate justice approach? And are working on something that's kind of positive and optimistic, and are trying to address resilience in a radically different way, and in a way that's sort of a page from Katrina, because it was grassroots organizations that were really racing to address the problem of Katrina in ways that our government couldn't. So he said, oh, you gotta go see Orrin Williams. So that's why I wound up going to Englewood. It was because of Orrin Williams. So he sort of took me on this tour. Now, the reason I kind of wound up being in the movie was when I said to Orrin at some point, I said, so do you consider this a heat emergency plan? And he said, no, this is a human emergency plan. Like, I'm working on changing systems. Like, I don't think like that. Anyway, I said, well, don't you consider this kind of like a new form of disaster preparedness? And he's like, no, you do. I don't. Now at this point, he probably would say I do, but at the time, it's taken me so long to make this movie. 2007, he didn't. And 2011, he didn't. But by that point, I was like deep into the world of disaster preparedness, and I was trying to take Dr. Whitman's analysis of like, if this isn't a disaster, I don't know what the hell is. It's like, why aren't, like, they're stockpiling diabetes medication in case there's an earthquake, but they're not dealing with diabetes. Like, that is so crazy. Now, I like crazy. Like, I like the juxtaposition of crazy because people are so cynical that unless you juxtapose worlds, it's very hard for people to kind of see the concurrency of all the crazy because they're living in 10024 and they don't see what's going on the other side of town. So, the north side, people on the north side of Chicago do not have to go to the south side of Chicago. I mean, unless there's a really nice brunch place, they might not go, right? Unless, like, they just won't. So I felt like I had to kind of put these pieces together, and none of my characters were necessarily doing that because they were working in their own space. So at a certain point, my editors and the people I was working with were like, Judith, no one is gonna suture this together and connect these dots unless you do. And we like going on the trip with you. And then at a certain point, because I started this in 2003, the world was in a really different place by the time I was finishing this. And I really wanted to take the white community on this trip. And I really wanted those of us who have benefited from redlining and who are the beneficiaries of structural racism to have to go on this trip and look at it and deal with it. And that would only happen if I tried to do that and kind of model that for a certain. So it's a moment in the filmmaking world where, sometimes people will say like, don't tell that story unless, like, don't tell that story unless we tell that story. There's a real politics of storytelling and who gets to tell the story and, who gets to, are you gonna tell the story about this poor disenfranchised community? Because if you do, you're only gonna see that and you're not gonna see the extraordinary activism and the extraordinary pride and the radical resilience that's taking place. And I feel at times like maybe I didn't, if I was telling this movie now, I'd probably do it in a different way, but that was the reason why my voice is in there, because I want to take people on the trip.
I think I want to open it up to the audience to see if there are any questions, and of course we can keep weaving back and forth. Are there any questions? There are, oh, yeah, one right there.
What did Dr. or PhD Whitman, what did he die of? Because you had listed on screen, I think, 1943 to 2014.
Yeah, he died of cancer.
Oh, unfortunately.
Excuse me?
Unfortunately.
Unfortunately, it's a huge loss. But he has inspired generations of public health workers and community health workers and epidemiologists and very radical activists, and they definitely are sort of keeping his dream alive, and his work and his methodology has really been a gift to the field. So just last year, NYU Langone, they put out a study, and it's kind of like a community dashboard study, and they're looking at life expectancy gaps in in cities around the country, and basically taking all of this public health data and turning it around and giving it to people in a way to sort of say, like, this is egregious, this is insane, look at this in your very own city, look at this lifespan gap, what do you want to do with it? So there, you know, that is absolutely a response to Dr. Whitman's work, and it really comes out of what he's been trying to do and was doing in Chicago.
Is there another question?
Hey, thank you. To what extent is the discipline of art and science, the differences between them, to what extent is that difference meaningful to you in your work?
Why don't you answer that?
None.
Can you repeat the question again?
To what extent is the difference between art and science meaningful to you in your work?
Well, with my work as to climate activism, they're literally intertwined and connected all the time. You can see in every single march and protest from as far back as you can see, everyone either rallying about putting at least 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere as a cap, or you see people just putting up simple art of just them holding their loved ones, keeping them from suffering from from an unfortunate climate fate. And I feel like both really incorporate into my work and they really strengthen each other, especially when you're in a march or a rally, and even in just like a city council meeting, advocating for a divestment campaign or for not promoting new fossil fuel projects. And it's really resounding, especially seeing with like the youth climate strikes across the country that I've been part of and everything, seeing students come out of class and making these banners and posters with their friends, incorporating things that they've learned in their environmental classes or their science classes, and taking it to the streets and saying, we don't want this to happen to us. We know this is happening. It's gonna affect my kids, my grandkids, and my great-grandkids, and their kids. And we want to see a change now. And they just, in the end, they just pulling each other up, art and science, and intertwined to make basically a new, I'd say like a new form of thinking that everyone can understand and that is synonymous.
Can you talk a little bit about? I'm gonna ask you to push it in the other direction too, where using art gets some of the youth around you to be interested in the science and the stuff that disturbs you and moves you to action. So are there songs, I mean, even the chants themselves are songs, right? And the art that you're going in the other direction too, getting people interested in the science of it.
No, yeah, obviously we can all agree that like some like really like big like meme or something on a poster can really bring attention to whatever you're doing and can get people riled up or confused or just ask about what you're doing. And I think that in the end, art can actually empower people into learning more about whatever you're talking about. I'm not that great of an artist, but I find artistic things move me still. And I think a bit more in a linear, like scientific type way, but art is a bit more abstract, but also has a sense of like calming and resolve and intention that is really important and that people can really get behind. And especially if you incorporate it with science or as just like a gateway into climate activism and climate justice is also really important. And I think that kind of is what gets a lot more of my peers into it nowadays. So yeah.
I just wanted to say something real quick. Can't take the politics out of your question. The distribution of power around the organization of knowledge. It's really, these are really inspiring words that you're bringing to us today. But I would say, be careful. Be cognizant that the distribution of power between arts and sciences is not right now on a level playing field. and the constant push toward more STEM, and there's never enough STEM, and we need to go push forward into STEM, and it works on those politics in a way that it's not, and I don't want this to sound like, oh, this guy is just, sour because he's a social scientist and he's non-STEM. No. It's not about that anymore. It's about our survival. The lack of convergence between arts and sciences is going to kill us. But,
I think they're very intertwined for me, and I'm interested in this, sort of like the science of how do you make people's hearts open up and get soft enough so that they could see and feel what they don't really want to see and feel, because it's really painful, and the more that we're open to feeling, the more we have to sort of figure out, what am I going to do with this? It's complicated and it's uncomfortable, and how long can I sustain being this uncomfortable? Then I'm going to go home and I'm going to be comfortable, and it's like, well, that was just a movie. But you know what? Maybe it wasn't just a movie. Maybe it was a movie that'll lead you to move somewhere, have some movement. So, you said before that, damn it, like, why are those people that are in charge of disaster preparedness so hard and they can't move and they don't see it? But what I have found, which has been amazing, is that there's people in these agencies and in these offices who are in charge of budgets, and who are civil servants, and who are elected officials, and who really do believe in democracy, and who are really on the right side of things, and who are staying in those offices because they're terrified that if they leave, people will come in who are like really bad, and they inevitably will invite me in this film, and they'll say, I love this new idea. I love that reframe. I love the idea of first responders. I know that they are first responders, and I know that, yes, if we invested in the infrastructure of the most vulnerable, quote unquote, I'm putting quotes around it, communities, and we invested in the schools that have been closed down, and we invest in the libraries, and we don't think about cooling centers and heating centers, but like we think about civic centers and community centers, we think about economic development, that is the best form of disaster preparedness. And I know that that's true, and I also know that we only invite them to lunch, and then we ask them to help us figure out how the social networks work, but we're not willing to invest in the social networks and the social cohesion that they work out every single day. But I do know that that's more important than investing in the next truck. But when I talk about it with my colleagues, they think I'm crazy. So I want to bring your movie in, so your thesis is out there, and then we have to talk about it. It's not coming from me, it's sort of coming from the outside. So that's where the intersection of like a science, because that's a scientist or a social scientist or a real scientist, right? Someone who works in numbers or an actuary, like they're inviting me in because the scientists need the artists so that they can have their crazy idea and no one looks at them like they're crazy. And so my hope is that what we're trying to do, and it's hard to figure out how to crack the code, and we're desperately trying to raise enough money so we can keep this engagement going, is to like offer the reframe to the people who are inside in charge of the budgets, and then offer the reframe to the grassroots organizers who don't necessarily want to think of themselves as disaster preparedness people, and who don't necessarily think of themselves as doing, wow, I'm doing disaster preparedness work. But if they actually recast themselves as doing that, they would have so much more access to Homeland Security money. They would have so much more access to those rooms. And they would become, they are the experts, and they would be treated as experts. So that's kind of like what we're trying to do, is to use art to bring the activists and the scientists together in a new radical way, and try to put those relationships, try to help put climate justice and racial justice and economic justice at the center of all of the adaptation and the disaster preparedness, which it isn't, clearly it isn't.
Have you shown this in Chicago, and how did that go? And then within some of these bureaus where maybe some change could be affected?
We showed it in Chicago last summer on the 24th anniversary of the heat wave. We had a 2-week theatrical run, and that was really effective. And we kind of tried to make little mini town halls each night in a theater that was kind of half the size of this, and they was usually packed, and it was really great. We gathered postcards, which we haven't sent yet, for the mayor to ask her to join this burgeoning new movement that's happening in a couple of cities and counties around the country, which is to officially declare racism a public health crisis. And they're doing that reframe because with the idea that if you do, then it opens up sort of more money. And it's like, now I don't know, like, what do you think about that? Do you think, is it possible for us to actually address racism for what it is, or do we have to rename it a public health crisis? Do you think that's a good strategy?
I think it's a pretty good strategy. I just feel like sometimes it's hard for people to digest and stuff. You know, it's 2020, there's a whole bunch of new ways that people are finding to oppress someone else. And I feel like renaming it in the end would probably be beneficial, and like giving it a new purpose and stuff, and adding more things to it. Like there's a whole bunch of other things to racism other than just calling someone the N-word. And there's like also just like not a lot of access to healthcare, Medicare, redlining, gentrification in cities, and a whole bunch of other things. Colonialism, very big. And there's a whole bunch of other things that are incorporated other than that. And I feel like renaming it or restructuring it would also probably incorporate that better.
So that's what we try to do. So, but we have to go back. Now we're trying to leverage the 25th anniversary, because the only way to get press on this is as an anniversary, and they have to write about it. And then they write about it in this whole new frame. It's like, oh, it's not about the heat. It's about the long-term impact of structural racism. So
we're going to gear
Chicago
up for that.
hasn't finished with us yet.
Well, it doesn't only have to be Chicago.
No.
Right. We can write those postcards too. We have another question in the audience. Yes.
Hi, thank you for this film. So we live in a predominantly white, predominantly middle-class town, and I think that a lot of people here benefit off of the broken system that we've talked about today. And you know, Katie and I, we climate strike every Friday, and we know that people don't feel the need to empathize and they don't feel the need to take action because they're not currently feeling as though they're being directly impacted by it. So I wonder, an issue like this that feels so distant to so many people here, how do we get them to feel empathy? How do we get them to feel urgency when it feels so far away and so irrelevant to them?
Well, I mean, I would love to hear from both of you. I mean, I guess my first question is, like, there's got to be a way that this is relevant to here. Like, this is not, this is about, we use Chicago as a landscape, but this story is happening in every city in this country.
It's right.
It's got to be happening here.
There's poverty and racism and the intersection of both spitting distance from the State Theater. So why don't we commit, people in the audience and whoever wants to reach out to people who can get in touch with Miranda and her activism and make sure that we can activate what it is that you do here every Friday. Because, you know, just driving to just outside of whatever bubble we have placed ourselves in, which I'm very glad you're addressing, it's not as much work as you might think, which is both the good news and also the bad news. So I'm glad a film like this will activate it, and you never know who's sitting here in the audience, and we'll reach out to you, and we'll, I commit to connect you as well.
Where do you climate strike?
Yeah, so we climate strike from 12 to 1 p.m. at the municipal building every single Friday. There you go. If you live here, you should show up.
Taya, can you repeat your question one more time?
Yeah. So, I'm just sort of, my question is, how do we take an issue that feels really distant and really irrelevant to so many people in maybe whiter, more privileged communities, and how do we get them to feel urgency and take action and feel empathy?
Like, what I found really effective in like trying to gain a new audience and bigger audience, other than my little activism group that I've got going on in Beaverton, is try to like make it a bigger topic to something that they can relate. I know that Pennsylvania has a lot of fracking and a lot of coal exports and production, and it really affects a lot of the communities around those fracking areas, and also the coal miners and their families in those areas, and showing that that fracking is a very big issue and very big problem, but also not making them feel isolated, and that's their fault that they're working in those jobs, but also providing like solutions like greener jobs that they could help endorse, or pressure on your politicians and your also here at Penn State for more sustainable sources of energy, or pushing for adding solar panels onto roofs of buildings, or geothermal energy, and just like making it a bit more personable to the communities that are affected, and also to the people around those communities that can see this happening too, is a way to really connect with people and really make it about where you're from, rather than just seeing something on a screen.
Thank you.
I just wanted to tell you, because I come from a university culture where the student movement has a long history of bringing the university face to face to issues that go from poverty to climate change. They don't necessarily do it from 12 to 1. And they usually don't tell the administration exactly where they're going to do it, because that's the point. But the fact is that I go back to the art. Students have converged, and they are less hung up on the discipline that they study and what they're and more about the issue. And storytelling has been one. Storytelling has affected my policy world. Policy world is now looking at storytelling as an excellent policy tool, and yeah. And so look at telling your story. Study your stakeholders around State College. Look whose business is touched by weather. From Tosi Mountain to look and look for empathy in your story. Develop that story and take it around. Perhaps not in the usual place where you take it from 12 to 1. Well, and get creative. I'll be more than glad to talk to you guys about the student movement in the University of Puerto Rico, because right now they're the only ones standing up for a budget cut of over a half of our budget. That's going to kill us. And my colleagues are not standing up for the university, and they are. So.
Awesome, thank you. I think there's some good tips there. And also in terms of commitment, through Belisario and Sustainability Institute, Democracy, the McCourtney Democracy Institute, and others, we are going to be working, possibly even with you, on helping teenagers, local teenagers, tell stories through film about their activism, since that's probably the only way they can vote until they're 18. So, and we'll bring those films to you. It looks like people are slowly leaving. I would have liked to have gotten another question from the audience, but I think what we'll do is, well, one last question. Okay, so we have time? Gotta ask the boss. Gotta ask the boss.
So twofold. One, where do you see the view of public education in supporting the movement? And secondly, a little bit different, do you ever reflect on how our society has responded to the opioid epidemic and how it connects to like what you're doing? Are there any lessons learned there?
You know, there's a really interesting movie called, and it's on Netflix, so you can see it. It's still there. It's called Heroine, but it's a play on the word heroine, and it's about this woman it's about two women, really, three women, but one of them is a judge, and one of them is she's a police officer whose specialty is sort of being there to help out people who are just at that moment of ODing, practically dying. And they have a whole new way of responding, helping people sort of go through a recovery movement versus going to jail. And it's sort of like restorative humanity in a way. And I think it's addressed, they're really trying to find new ways to kind of address a public health crisis and put people at the center. And they're recognizing that it's about lack of economic development, and it's about a lack of jobs, you know, and it's not just about personal will, it's about the failure of, you know, of our towns and our cities to really be responsive places that put the whole community, you know, at the centerpiece, rather than just blaming people for being addicts. So, you know, I was very moved by them and their innovation and the way that they're trying to create new models. And I think those kinds of new models that address systemic problems in new and innovative ways are really, really important. And that's exactly what I see happening sort of on the community level in communities that have basically been left to die, and for cities to kind of warehouse the land until they figure out how to gentrify it and move everybody out. So, you know, I do see a parallel. And in terms of public education, it's a zip code thing, you know? It's those zip codes where there's parents who can put more money into their public schools, those public schools thrive. And if the parents can't do it, I mean, I live in one of the most segregated and racist school districts in the United States. It's called the Upper West Side of Manhattan. And I didn't even know that until my little girl had to go to kindergarten. And I didn't want her to go to the really great school that everybody moves to my neighborhood to go to, PS 166, where they expect parents to put $2,500 in per kid, and who are basically paying to have our school be kind of like a private school, except it's a public school. But we go to the Title I school, and because I didn't want her to be one of two black little girls in her classroom till she's in 5th grade. You know, and I didn't want her to experience the aggression that I've experienced when people have said, but Judith, she's not that black. How can you not send her to 166? It's like, that's exactly why I'm not sending her to 166. So she goes to PS 75, and I've never felt more a part of New York City till my kid went to this school. And at drop-off, I'm like, wow, I actually live in the city. I didn't realize that on 84th Street, I was totally living the red line life. So, you know, our public schools, it's like we have to make a commitment to public education and make sure that every school has the resources. And we can't close them in neighborhoods like Inglewood because it's convenient, you know, to do that. Because the schools are the anchors. And when the schools thrive, the community thrives. And that's the best disaster preparedness system that we could have, is to invest in our schools instead of the military and that crazy air show, which is just a metaphor for what we're doing.
Yeah. So thank you. In closing, I would like to go down the road here, and hopefully this will inspire each of us to think about what we can do. What's next steps for each of you, just briefly? What's next for you with the work that you're doing?
So my next step is obviously doing the climate training this weekend, and then also as part of the lawsuit, we've had a little bump in the case with a little dismissal, but it's okay, the case is still going on, and it's far from over, and if anything, we're just into a new phase. It's been bouncing up and down from the Supreme Court all the way back down to the District Court, and we're just waiting to see what our next strategy is and our plan is, so stay tuned.
my next step is to successfully put my 10-year-old daughter Sophia to bed so that she can make it to school tomorrow morning. No.
So on that note, let's continue this conversation.
If you like what you saw this evening, we have a website. It's called cookedthefilm.com. You could sign up for the newsletter. You could think about how we could maybe bring the movie back here in some way, or you could bring the movie here, and you could utilize it to address the inequities in the zip codes here, and actually find out how does your disaster preparedness industry work here, and how much money are they spending on the new truck versus investing in something that is really quite essential. And we're going to be working on really trying to figure out how to leverage the hell out of this 25th anniversary in an interesting way. So that's what we're doing.
So, well, thank you. Thanks to all three of you
Thank
for being
you,
here with us.
Pearl.
Thank you for staying.
Thank you for all staying this evening. Thank you so much.
And thank you to all our sponsors, and especially for the Sustainability Institute for bringing this
Thank you,
program.
Peter
Have a good night.
Boger.